Welcome everyone to today's luncheon plenary, Facing Reality, Debating the Conclusions of BioCentury's 21st Annual Back to School Commentary. A lot of the big picture issues in the industry will be debated here, and it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Susan Schaeffer, who is editor of BioCentury. Susan?
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be back at the Bio Investor Forum, and thank you all for coming. The title of our panel is Facing Reality, which comes from BioCentury's 21st Annual Back to School essay. And I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to give you an overview of the conclusions that we came to in Back to School, and then we'll discuss some of those conclusions with our panel. In many ways, we said in Back to School, this is a great time to be in biotech. For the first time in many years, we're seeing money flowing into the sector again. We're seeing rising numbers of drug approvals in the US, Europe, and Japan. And in the US and Japan, these are the highest levels we've seen in a decade. And we now have new regulatory pathways that promise to further increase the speed of development and approval of breakthrough therapies that could be immensely valuable to patients who are gravely ill. At the same time, this tsunami of new drugs, many of which are first in class, are arriving onto the market in the midst of a continuing worldwide economic crisis, and right at the same time that aging populations and healthcare reform are swelling the ranks of people who are seeking care under both public and private insurance all around the world, from the US to China. In response to these pressures, governments, commercial insurers, and patients too are pushing back on the industry's traditional notions of innovation. And cost-constrained payers worldwide are making reimbursement contingent often upon the kinds of data that can take years of post-marketing experience to collect. And the drug industry's pricing power is in retreat. In the face of these external forces, BioCentury believes that reimbursement and access are the existential issue for companies and for patients too. We believe that drug companies need to rethink the kinds of products that stand a chance of reimbursement, the types of evidence that payers are going to require for reimbursement, and the prices that will be paid for drugs that clear those first two hurdles. So in Back to School, we identified 4 areas where industry could work to better face this new reality. And no doubt there are many other things that industry can do, and we certainly hope that others will put additional ideas on the table. But we focused on 4 in Back to School. And the first of these is changing pipelines and development programs to focus on meeting the needs of patients and payers as those 2 stakeholder groups define them. Engaging in a much more substantive way with patients and payers to share data that are held by each of these different stakeholders that can help to answer essential questions about drug development and reimbursement that no one stakeholder can answer on its own. Participating in health technology assessment in a way that drug developers can contribute knowledge to improve the process rather than fighting the process. And finally, finding ways to come to grips with the reality that the existing pricing paradigm as we know it is not sustainable. Now, small biotechs that are focused on scientific and technical innovation will not be exempt from these pressures. So we've invited a panel of investors and CEOs today to talk about what emerging biotechs need to do to address these existential forces. I'm joined today by Paul Hastings, who is president and CEO of Oncomed Pharmaceuticals, which is discovering and developing first-in-class mAbs against cancer stem cells. And Paul is also chair of the Emerging Companies section at Bio. Next to Paul is Jim Healy, a general partner at Sofinnova Ventures, which specializes in clinical and late preclinical investments in biopharmaceutical companies. Tom Hughes is president and CEO of Zafgen, which is developing a therapy for severe obesity with a novel mechanism of action. And Ed Mathers is a partner at NEA and a member of BIO's board. And NEA invests in biopharmaceutical companies at all stages of development with a focus on novel therapeutics in major disease areas, as well as selected investments in diagnostics and platforms. We'll leave some time at the end of our discussion for Q&A, and afterward we'll ask Aaron McAllister, a senior editor at BioCentury and one of the contributors to this year's Back to School essay, to offer some closing comments. So since we're focusing today on emerging companies whose bread and butter is scientific and technological innovation, I want to start our conversation with the notions of innovation and differentiation. And all of you are investing in and running emerging companies today, but in past lives you've worked in big companies too. So I'd like to ask each of you in turn, how are you defining differentiation, or rather, how are you defining innovation for your current companies? And is the way that you think about innovation today any different than it was 5 or 10 years ago? Starting with Paul.
Wow. Okay. So one thing I want to say before I comment on that is that I'm also a patient advocate. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease when I was 12 years old. I run a summer camp for kids who have 53 different diagnoses for bowel and bladder disorders. I don't have a colon, I have half a small intestine, and so I've been through a lot of the issues that a lot of patients go through. So I also look at this from a patient advocacy point of view, as well as being a member of the pharmaceutical innovation industry. So for me, innovation could be as simple as providing phase 1 clinical trial access to patients so that they can, in the case of inflammatory bowel diseases or in the case of cancer, that patients who have failed multiple rounds of other therapies have access to new drugs. And to me, that's an innovative step forward. So I am an optimist. I don't think you cannot be an optimist and be in this business. I don't think you can be a patient and not be an optimist. And so I believe innovation is improvement. And whether it's an incremental improvement, because remember in the 1980s when we were discovering and developing drugs for HIV, had we not come along with incremental improvements to AZT, we wouldn't have HIV being a chronic disease today. So it turned from a deadly disease into a chronic, manageable disease. I believe cancer is the same thing. I believe other forms of disease are the same thing as well. Combination therapies are the way of the future. I do believe, well, we can get into this later, but when we start talking about payers and the way payers look at things, I think everybody would love for there to be one drug that's going to treat one disease, and here's the price we're going to pay for that drug. That's not innovation to me. Innovation is taking risks in developing things. It's having the guts to stand up and saying incremental improvements will add up to large improvements potentially later. And that's the way I would look at it from a drug discovery point of view.
And we will come back to some of those issues around incremental innovation and how to value that later in the discussion. Jim?
Great. So as an active investor in the field, Sofinova really looks at funding products that we believe will be transformative for patients, that will extend life, that will improve the quality of life, decrease pain and suffering, avoid surgery, decrease hospitalization, and thereby also have an additional benefit for payers by decreasing the overall expenses. And so as a firm that specializes in mid and late stage drug development, we often look for those signals of differentiation in the clinic. And we need to find just not incremental benefit, but substantial differentiation from existing therapies, or often look for products that will be first in class, where there are no other approved alternatives.
Yeah, so in my former life, I think I left my last job, I had 45 projects under me. And I think the way that we defined innovation at the time was a number of things. It could be first approach to a brand new mechanism. It could be speed. In other words, one would differentiate if you could be faster than the competition on something everybody else is working on. Or you could differentiate in very small ways by modifying tissue penetration, duration of action of the drug, these types of things. And I think that was an approach that was really driven in many ways by the attrition model that was very popular and how portfolios were put together back 10 years ago. And I think it still is the case in a lot of organizations. But I would argue that in balance, it was hardly innovative, because in truth, the easiest and least innovative programs are the ones that always got there fastest and most cheaply. I think today it's like running a company that has one drug target that we're working on. We define innovation as all of that at the same time. And it's working on something new, making sure that you don't come up with a molecule that can be easily beat by somebody else, getting there fastest, and making sure that the drug meets the needs of patients and provides benefit that they wouldn't otherwise receive. So I think this is the nature of biotech, and it's what makes it so attractive. So I think, yeah, at least my own perspective has changed radically. I wouldn't go back.
Ed?
Yeah, I guess from my point of view, I think of things very simply when we talk about innovation. It really boils down to whatever we're talking about, does it meet a need? If it meets a need, by definition, it's innovative. Now the question becomes, you could debate the merits of how big that need is and the commercial value of it, but by default, it is an innovation. If I look at the industry in general, I mean, very few drugs work in 100% of patients, either A, from an efficacy point of view, or B, from a tolerance point of view. So by default, you're always going to have needs, even though the perception is that this market is satisfied. But that's not truly the case, and that's why you do see, and I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit about follow-ons and fast followers and everything else. Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't have those if there weren't those needs. Whether it's incremental improvement or 10% of the population suffers from this, I mean, there's still a need there, and by default, that's innovation.
And so, Jim first raised the issue of differentiation in this discussion of innovation. In diseases where there are approved treatments, whether they're drugs or other kinds of interventions, is there any value in innovation that doesn't lead to differentiated products?
For products that we don't believe are going to be differentiated, the answer is no. We, even if there may be a very clear linear opportunity to get a drug approved, if we don't believe at the end that it will provide significant patient benefit and be differentiated from existing therapies, it really won't, pass muster inside our shop.
So when it comes to thinking about how and when companies need to start focusing on differentiation, there are at least two different camps. There are people in our industry, investors, people in big pharma, people in larger companies who are now saying companies not only can but must start thinking about differentiation as early as discovery. And then there are those who say that it cannot be done and should not be done until programs are in the clinic, maybe even until programs have reached at least phase 2. I'd like to ask each of you, when do you think companies should begin thinking about differentiation, and when companies should begin trying to generate and collect data to support differentiation, if those two concepts are different in your minds? I'll start with Paul.
Right. I think we dream when we discover drugs that they're going to be differentiated. And when we discover drugs, we have to be dreamers. So I don't think that you could put a set of parameters around a discovery. Well, I'll equate sort of differentiation and a product profile with an NPV analysis, right? So think about doing an NPV analysis on a discovery pipeline. There's going to be about 600 different variables that is going to make that bubble as big as you want it or as small as you want it to be. So depending on who you are and you want that bubble to be small, you can control that bubble. Depending on how big you want that bubble to be, you can control how big you make that bubble. So when you're in discovery, you're automatically thinking you're going to get the biggest bubble possible. And that's what you want discovery people to think. Now, if they come along with something in discovery that's a target that's been exploited to its fullest, then it's fairly easy to say that's probably not going to be differentiated that much. That may fall into the smaller bubble. But if you come along with something in discovery that is novel and different, and you sit there, I'm just trying to imagine the conversation I have with our guys in discovery, who have, by the way, put 5 antibodies in the clinic from a patent. So they just discovered these 5 different antibodies, and there's 4 or 5 more coming. If I said to them, let's create a product profile, before you discover this, let's create a product profile. I don't know what that conversation would sound like. I think we all know what we want at the end of the day, but I think one of the things in discovery is you want people to be creative. And you spend a lot of time protecting them from processes and bureaucracy that gets in their way of being creative. So I think it's difficult to have the definition of differentiation, here's what I think it is, as say the commercial person or the payer or the ultimate purchaser of this drug when they're discovering things. And as it gets a little bit further through discovery and you start identifying or you start seeing what it looks like in different models, and there are other models in the past where you can look at and you can compare to those models, and I think you can start saying, well, it didn't look much different than this and that led to this. I think that's a good time when you can discuss it. But in the pure discovery phase, I think it would be impossible to have that discussion.
Yeah, I would agree there. Actually, I think you'd be wasting your time because the only guarantee is whatever parameters you put around it, you're going to be wrong. So, you know, especially if it's a novel target, I mean, you got to move it down a little bit, and you know, you're going to meander in the discovery phase. I mean, that's just the nature. You think you're going here, and you end up over here. Okay, how do you respond? So, I mean, as you evolve beyond discovery, and maybe you're moving toward the clinic, I think it makes sense. The only way I would look at it, though, is if it's a known target. And if it's a known target with proven agents, then you at least have a benchmark as to how you're going to differentiate. But if it's novel, I think you're really just wasting your time.
But the problem with that is that if you know what needs to be improved, so too does everybody else. And so you're differentiated, but you're in a swarm of people who are working on the same set of problems, unless it's your own internal knowledge that you're working from. So these things become really problematic, I think. You know, yeah, I mean, for example, coming to the differentiation thing. I mean, I think it's going to be context-driven. So different companies may have a very different set of constraints that they're operating under. So, you know, let's say they're working on a mechanism of action that has been heavily drugged by the industry, but what they need is they need their own molecule to make a fixed dose combination with a product that is unique to them. So, you know, that may be a very high level of innovation, not just for them, but for the patient, because they can combine it and sell it as a easier to use, maybe more effective combination product. So I think, you know, it's really going to depend on the needs of the business, but also, you know, what business you're in. In other words, if you're a fully integrated pharmaceutical company, you may have different drivers than you would be if you were a venture-backed biotech company.
Jim?
I would say as a physician scientist, you know, by training, when it comes to novel targets and novel biology, molecular differentiation preclinically, you have no idea where it's going to end up in terms of clinical differentiation and target product profile. So trying to draw a parallel between those two is next to impossible. And so I think, you know, in the circumstances where we invest in earlier stage opportunities, we're looking for the type of creativity and what I would call all-around athletes in a management team that can respond to the to's and fro's of drug discovery and drug development when it comes to novel biology. But I think it's next to impossible to speak about clinical differentiation and how you can address reimbursement and differentiated products when, you know, you're running mouse models.
Nonetheless, we know that increasingly payers are asking for the kinds of comparative effectiveness data that can show improved outcomes over standard of care when there is a standard of care. And in some diseases, you may not be able to do that until, if you're lucky, maybe you can begin to get an idea in phase 2. Sometimes it's not until phase 3. Sometimes it's not until a big phase 4 program. But can you think of examples of things that small companies can do early on that can begin to help make the case, or that can begin to maybe generate the kind of hypotheses that would sharpen what you're looking for in later stages as you're building toward, this eventual need to demonstrate a benefit over some therapy that exists? And Jim, I think maybe you could talk about Obseva.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about either Obseva or some other examples out of our portfolio. So if I look at 3 or 4 approvals we've had recently and look at the impact that those products have for patients, I guess I first would highlight Preglim as being one example. It was a company that was converting a surgical therapy into a non-surgical treatment paradigm with an oral kind of monthly dosage form. So in essence, replacing Obseva for women who've got fibroids with an oral pill. So they can either delay or avoid surgery. So that is paradigm shifting. And so they're able to show a benefit in the clinic through running their phase 3 studies of decreased overall bleeding, improved hematocrit, hemoglobin, but also the drug was debulking for fibroids. And as a result, women are able to delay or avoid surgery. And so that is converting a surgical treatment into an oral treatment, I think is a paradigm shift for those patients. By the same token, can look at Durata, which went public last year, an anti-infective company that the impact they can have for patients with skin infections, so for acute bacterial skin and skin structure infections, is if you look at the overall cost of therapy with the expenses that are associated with infusion centers or home health nursing that give drugs like Cubist or Cubicin, that they can save those patients and the payers that provide health care for them roughly $8,000 per patient through a drug that has a much longer PK. So it's a once-a-week drug as opposed to one that has to be given daily through indwelling catheters. And so again, a benefit for the patients from a quality of life perspective. It guarantees compliance because it's sustained delivery and can decrease the overall cost of care. And then you'd asked about Obseva, I guess, and use that as the final example. So this is one of our most recent investments. It happens to be the same management team that had run, the same founding CEO that had run Preglim. And there they're focused on a very large opportunity in preterm labor and delivery. And if you look at the overall cost, the cost in the United States, there are cost healthcare system here in the US about $25 billion in terms of the lifelong complications of preterm labor and delivery. And so if one can extend labor in these women with a novel drug, such as the one that Obseva is developing, and extend labor by 2 to 3 weeks, the implications are huge. The average cost for preterm labor is about $25,000 to $40,000. If you look at ultra preemies that are born before 26 or 27 weeks, it costs upwards of $200,000 per patient. And so an oral therapy for women at risk for preterm labor can have a huge impact across the entire spectrum and be a big cost savings for payer systems.
And so maybe even at this early stage, one of the things then that I would take away from that smaller companies can do is define what the opportunity is.
Right.
And
ask the questions.
Right.
And at times you don't know what the data will be, but if you ask the right set of questions as you're running trials, we've had some bluebird opportunities as well where we didn't know. We knew that the drug would be effective and meet its primary endpoint that regulators were looking for, but we weren't sure if there would be the added benefit of decreasing hospitalizations or ICU time, and have seen circumstances where you can decrease that by a factor of 3 to 5, which is huge when it costs $10,000 per patient per day to be in the ICU. So,
Tom, what do you do in the earlier stages of development to begin to lay the groundwork for the questions that will come once you get to market?
Yeah, I sort of chuckled a little bit when you talked about the demands that payers have on us. I would say the demands that investors have on us is probably much greater at this point, to really show that what we're doing is different from everybody else. But I think the key really has been to be able to show that there is comparative efficacy that exceeds what you would see with other agents. I think we're sort of tempted to ask the question in the clinic whether patients would respond better to our drug than the comparators, but in our instance, the comparator drugs hadn't actually been available early enough to do that head-to-head comparison. So I think in our case, it's really looking at what it is that causes the failure for drugs to work effectively, and to really ask deeply and carefully what evidence do we have that would suggest that they're going to be there, whether it's a higher responder rate or whether it's a type of patient who we know would not respond well to the other agents, or just to show, as I said earlier, that the mechanisms are inherently complementary, so that in combination it would work well.
But
so I think that's, but maybe I'm not answering your question.
No, you are, but I recall from some of our earliest conversations with you about Zafgen, talking about not just the comparator of other agents that were then still in the pipeline, but also surgical interventions.
Yeah, so in our case, our drug, and I'm not here to give an advertisement, but our drug, is being positioned, if you will, as a pharmacological alternative to bariatric surgery, very much along the lines of what we're just talking about. In other words, to provide a therapeutic benefit that can only today be reached through surgical intervention. And I think there it's really, looking at providing the extent and magnitude, in our case, of weight loss that one just can't see with other agents. And I think it's a bit of an audacious goal to say that you're going to give 2 to 3 times the rate of response, or 2 to 3 times the overall effectiveness of another agent. But that's what we focus on. And I think if we can't differentiate, we don't have a product at the end of the day that's going to be worth selling. So that's the way we're looking at it.
Yeah, I think the key point that was raised by Jim is you got to define the opportunity. If you think about it from the venture point of view, and NEA has been very active in the orphan space, one of the reasons why we're in the orphan space is A, no unmet need, B, a lot of these patient opportunities are single gene mutations or whatever. So when you're thinking about comparative effectiveness, you're really comparing it to no treatment
Nothing.
and cost of care. And whether, if a patient has to be institutionalized or is going to die young, I mean, the comparison's easy. So, and not only that, it's a very capital efficient model. So I think if you define the right opportunity, I think the comparative effectiveness becomes a little bit more straightforward than you might think otherwise.
Now, we've been talking so far about how and when to try to prospectively design R&D programs to anticipate the kinds of questions that payers are going to ask after approval. But I want to ask Ed and Jim both, since both NEA and Sofinova do invest in later stage